China's economic development has been one of the most successful stories in recent decades. More than 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Since 2010, China is the world's second-largest economy when measured by nominal GDP, and the world's largest economy since 2017 when measured by purchasing power parity. But lately, a lot seems to be happening in China.
Next global financial crisis.
How the authorities are trying to keep things under control and life savings into a company called Evergrande.
Its impact to the overall economy.
The war clouds over Taiwan.
Chinese economy looks different than it did just a few years ago. China is about to enter into a major debt crisis and the real estate market is on the verge of collapse. People are struggling to find jobs, deal with the rising cost of living and even to lead a normal life. Where did all these problems come from, and what will all this lead to? What is really happening in China? One of the most important developments in the world system over the last few decades has been the rise of China as a new power in the world. It started in the late 1970s. Before this, the state policies kept the economy very poor, stagnant, centrally controlled, vastly inefficient, and relatively isolated from the global economy. Private enterprises and foreign-invested firms were generally barred. Sectors like the agriculture industry and trade were owned and controlled by the state. China was one of the poorest countries in Asia and among the bottom 10% of the poorest countries in the world. In 1978, the Chinese government decided to break with its Soviet-style economic policies by gradually initiating economic reforms and trade liberalization, opening up to foreign trade and investment, and implementing free market reforms. New economic policies were added to educate and skill the population. In the 1980s, the Chinese government subsidized up to 70% of skill development, schooling, and other expenses. All these attracted huge foreign investments. Industrial companies from all over the world looking for cheap and skilled labor started to come one after another, moving their production to China and bringing so many investments that they eventually turned China into a global factory. The major factor in China's rapid economic growth is urbanization. While China was opening up to the world, most people lived in rural areas, and foreign investments poured into cities. Megacities appeared all over China as hundreds of millions of people moved from the countryside to urban areas for better life and opportunities. This huge urbanization drive provided cheap labor and kept China's manufacturing costs low, and further helped in boosting China's economic growth. This huge economic growth also created pressure on these internal migrants because of something called the Hukou system. The primary objective of this Hukou or the household individual system is the control of internal migration, and this resulted in the classification of individuals into either urban or rural residents. Unless they obtain a government-issued Hukou, they will not be able to gain access to education, employment, food services, healthcare, and other public services. Even if you move to a city for work, it is still very difficult to change your permit and obtain an official urban residency in a city. So a lot of the people that moved to the cities officially remained as residents in their rural areas, and getting a residency and escaping the Hukou system became a top priority for most. The primary requirement for getting a residency was stable accommodation. Thus, owning property was a prerequisite for living a normal life, and in turn created an enormous demand for real estate. This high demand has been driving real estate prices higher and higher and has been one of the major drivers of China's economic growth in the last 2 decades. China's real estate sector is huge. Estimated to be twice the size of the US residential housing market and accounts for about 1/4 of China's GDP. Because there has been such a demand for homes, and property prices have been growing so fast, the market as a whole turned into a massive speculative bubble. Everyone expected the prices to grow forever. Large property developers started to build more and more projects on the market, taking out larger and larger loans to be able to do that. People were buying apartments even before they were built, and these pre-sales and deposits became developers' major funding sources for the next projects. Lately, due to high prices, debts, and economic conditions, property sales declined by as much as 20 to 30%. This in turn created a cash crunch for many firms and found themselves unable to complete in-progress developments. But this has sparked a wave of mortgage boycotts. People have taken to the streets, and are refusing to pay mortgages for flats that have not yet been built and whose construction is now on hold. It looks like many of the largest property developers are failing to repay loans and might not even survive. Investing in property has consistently outperformed the market, and hence a large portion of people own even multiple properties. The local government sells land to raise revenues and additionally uses the land as collateral to borrow more. All these add to the risk that the property market crisis will drag the entire economy down with it, as it will affect everything from suppliers, small and medium-sized companies, banks, as well as household consumption. The average wages and household income in China did not grow in comparison to real estate growth, making it extremely difficult for average people to buy their own homes. The fact that owning property was both extremely important and extremely difficult, created an enormous pressure on people to work harder in order to get ahead and get a better job, higher salary, and one day, a mortgage, an apartment, and finally a chance to live a normal life with access to basic public services. The never-ending stream of people coming into the cities pushed the bar of how hard everyone worked even further and turned China into one of the most competitive societies in the world. The famous Chinese 996 work culture, a culture of working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, is a symbol of this. The Chinese culture itself promotes hard work, and as the economy started rising, working overtime was encouraged by the government, as a way for the country to get ahead and grow the economy even faster. Though there are regulations restricting this, people still follow this as the competition rises. Repeated reports of deaths from overworking under the 996 system prove that the extremely intense work culture does not seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Like in many other Asian countries, education has a major place in Chinese society and is perceived as the best way to move up the socio-economic ladder. China's universities produce millions of graduates each year. About 9 million university graduates entered the job market in 2021 and more than 10 million in 2022. There are simply not enough qualified jobs for the number of qualified people. While China's economy has been transforming from manufacturing to services and the demand for college-educated people has been growing, it is not transforming nearly fast enough. Since the slow economic growth and recent COVID-related regulations are affecting companies, they are firing more people than they hire. There are reports of companies withdrawing employment offers given to new graduates. In 2022, the youth unemployment rate reached a record level of almost 20%. All of this had a drastic impact on the young people in the country. The situation has produced movements that encourage people to give up and stop trying. These movements like lying flat and let it rot encourage people to reject the competition and stop pursuing these goals as they seem more and more impossible to achieve. COVID-19 has also taken a toll on China's economic growth. The zero-COVID policy is an attempt to prevent any community spread of the coronavirus, implementing a strategy of using strict, targeted lockdowns and mass testing. To control the massive outbreak in Shanghai, officials imposed a lockdown for weeks, restricting the city's 25 million residents from leaving their homes for any reason other than medical emergencies. Another issue is China's aging population. China has one of the fastest-growing aging populations in the world. China introduced its one-child policy in 1979 to suppress excessive population growth. According to estimates, the share of the population aged 60 and older in China in 2020 is about 264 million, which is about 19% of the total population. By 2040, this is expected to reach about 30% of the total population. Population aging results in heightened family care burdens and pressure on basic public services. The government has started to take measures to address this. This already stressed economy is further pressured by the recent heat wave and drought. Record-breaking heatwave and drought have caused some rivers in China to dry up and are affecting agriculture, hydropower, shipping, factory operations and even drinking water supply. Differences over Taiwan's status is another issue. Taiwan has been governed independently of China since 1949, but China views the island as part of its territory and has vowed to eventually unify Taiwan with the mainland, using force if necessary. China claims that Taiwan is bound by an understanding known as the 1992 Consensus, but the two sides don't agree on the content of this so-called consensus. Any problems that China was dealing with in the past were watered down by the enormous Chinese economic growth. But now that the growth has slowed down, a lot of the underlying issues are starting to come out, and the country is facing a storm of several different economic crises. A full-blown financial crisis is unlikely. Chinese households historically have very high rates of savings. Moreover, major banks are state-owned, and will not be allowed to fail. The government's control over the banks and much else in the economy suggests a slowdown rather than a collapse. But this depends on the effectiveness of the government measures addressing these crises. There's more to the story of how China rose from a poverty-driven era to a global superpower, like Hong Kong. Also, there are other relevant political issues present, like Hong Kong. But that seems like a topic for another video.